Hello everyone, my name's Stonesy Boy and welcome back to Metamorphosis, or in more of a real case, Reading with Stonesy. Today we are reading the last chapter, technically, of Metamorphosis, but there's going to be a video afterwards of some subtext, I think. I think it's just going to talk about stuff like, how the book was written and all that. But I should stop talking. We're going to be here for another 40 minutes anyways, so we are reading exactly 33 pages, and, yeah, without further ado, let's begin. The grievous wound Gregor had received, which plunged him over a month, the apple remained lodged in his flesh. A visible memento, since no one dared to remove it, seemed to have reminded even his father that Gregor, despite his current laminal, repulsive form, was the member of the family who should not be treated like an enemy, for family duty dictated that the others swallow down the disgust he aroused in them and show them tolerance, only tolerance. And even though this wound cost Gregor some of his mobility, probably for good, and for the time being he required many minutes to hobble across the room like an old invalid crawling up the walls and out of the question now, he was compensated for his worsening in the condition by what seemed to him a perfectly adequate substitute. As the evening approached, the door to the living room, on which he would start keeping a sharp eye of the hour or two beforehand, would always be opened as it permit him. Lying in his own dark room and invisible from the living room, we watch his entire family sitting at a brightly lit table and listen to the conversations now, as if it were in an officially sanctioned capacity and thus quite differently than before. To be sure, these are no longer animated conversations of earlier times, but Gregor used to think back on a certain longing from various cramped hotel rooms when it was time to throw himself exhausted into the damp bedding. Now everything was fairly quiet. Gregor's father would fall asleep in the armchair soon after supper. His mother and sister would admonish one another in silence. His mother bent far over beneath the light. It would be sewing ladies' underthings for the dress shop. His sister, who had taken a job as a salesgirl, was studying stenography and French in the evening so that it was possibly moved for a better position later on. Sometimes Gregor's father would wake up and, as if aware he had been sleeping, would say to Gregor's mother, "How long have you been sewing again today?" and would go right back to sleep. When he would prompt, Gregor's mother and sister exchanged weary smiles. In a particular form of stubbornness, Gregor's father refused to take off the porter's uniform even at home, and while the nightshirt hung uselessly on its hook, he would slumber where he sat, fully clothed as though he remained steady for the service at all times, even where he was waiting for supervisor's call. As a result, his uniform, which had not been new to start with, soon forfeited much of the cleanliness, despite the care lavished by his mother and sister, and Gregor would sometimes gaze for an entire evening at the stain-covered jacket replanted in the gold buttons, always highly polished, in which the old man slept in considerable discomfort but nonetheless soundly. The moment the clock struck 10, Gregor's mother would attempt to rouse his father in a few hushed words and then persuade him to go to bed, for he would get no proper sleep sitting there, and sleep was something Gregor's father, who would report for duty at 6 in the morning, desperately needed. But in keeping his stubbornness it had taken him when he started working as a porter, he always insisted on continuing to sit there at the table, even though he kept falling asleep, and then it was only a greatest effort it would persuade him to exchange armchair for bed. Gregor's mother and sister would persist their little astonishments as doggedly as they liked. For a quarter of an hour he would shake his head slowly, his eyes closed, without getting up. Gregor's mother would pluck at his sleeve, whispering cajoling words in his ear, and his sister would let aside their studies to come to her mother's aid. But to no avail, Gregor's father only settled deeper into his armchair. Only when the woman gripped him beneath the arms would he open his eyes, looking by turns at mother and sister and saying, "What sort of life is this? If this is the peace and quiet of my old age?" Then, supported by two women, he would rise elaborately, as though he himself were receiving a brunt of his burden, and allow the women to escort him to the doorway, where he would shoo them away and continue on his own, while Gregor's mother hastily threw down her sewing and his sister her pen, so they would run after him to offer further assistance. The household was never further reduced. The maid was now let go after all. A bony giant of a chair woman with white hair flapping about her head came by in the morning and evening and performed the heaviest labors. Everyone else was handled by Gregor's mother, along with all her sewing. It even came to pass that several pieces of jewelry had been in the family. Jewels Gregor's mother and sister had delighted in wearing in the entertainments and festivities. They're sold, as Gregor would learn in the evening, and price each piece he has brought would be discussed. But the greatest lament was always that they're unable to leave his apartment, which is far too large for their current circumstances, since no one could imagine how Gregor might have been moved. But Gregor understood that it was not only out of consideration for him that a move was being ruled out, since he could only enough have been transported in a crate of appropriate size, with a few air holes. The main thing keeping the family and moving in a new apartment was their complete sense of hopelessness, and thought that they had been struck with misfortune such as no one else in the entire circle of relations a friend had ever experienced. They're fulfilling the utmost in demands in the world makes on the poor. Gregor's father fetched breakfast for the petty employees at the bank. His mother sacrificed herself in the underclothes of the strangers. His sister ran back and forth behind the shop counter for the customer's behest. But it was all going to strength they had, and the wound in Gregor's back would have begun to ache anew when mother and sister, having brought his father to bed, would now return and leaving their work where it lay, huddled close behind another, pressing their cheeks together. When Gregor's mother, gesturing toward the room, would say, "Shut the door now, Great." And when Gregor was left in the dark again, while next door the two women intermingled their tears, or else sat there tearless, staring down at the table. Gregor spent his nights and days almost entirely without sleeping. Sometimes he had thought about taking the family affairs in hand again. He just used to. The next time the door was open, and once more his boss and general manager would appear before his mind's eye after all the time. The clerk in the apprentices, the dull-witted hired man, 2 or 3 friends from other firms, and a chambermaid from the provincial hotel, a sweet, fleeting spectre, the shop girl from a haberdashery whom he had courted earnestly but too slowly, of all appeared to him, intersped with the strangers of nearly already forgotten. But instead of coming to his aid, that was family, every last one of them was unapproachable, and he was glad when they disappeared. At other times he would not be at all in frame of the mind to look after his family. Instead he was filled with rage at how poorly he was attended to, and although he would not imagine anything he could have liked to eat, he plotted how he might have gained access to the pantry so to help himself to what, despite his total absence of hunger, was his due, without bothering to consider how she might give Gregor particular pleasure. His sister would particularly thrust some randomly chosen foodstuff into his room with her foot on her day to work in the morning and the midday, only sweep it out again at night with a quick swipe of the broom, paying no heed if the food had been only barely nibbled at or, as was most often the case now, not touched at all. Setting Gregor's room to rights, a task he now saved for the evening, could not possibly have been done at any other functionality. Great stakes of dirt extended across the walls, with balls of dust and rubbish lying scattered about. At first, when Gregor's sister came into the room, he would position himself in corners, particularly indicative of this problem, to reapproach her, as it were, by the presence there, but he could as well have spent entire weeks sitting there without any improvement on his sister's part. After all, she saw dirt as plainly as he did, but made up her mind to leave it be. At the same time, with the sensitivity that made it in her, one had now taken hold of the family as a whole. She had her guard to make sure his task of tidying Gregor's room was reserved for her. Once Gregor's mother subjected his room through scrubbing, when she accomplished only using up several buckets of water immediately, all this moisture was itself an informant to Gregor, who lay stretched out, bitter and immobile, upon the settee, but his mother did not escape the punishment, for no sooner had his sister remarked the change in Gregor's room in the evening had she ran into the mother's imploringly raised hands, set into weeping so violently that her parents, naturally her father was started out of his chair, at first stood by helpless and astonished, until they began to stir. On the right, Gregor's father reproached his mother for not having left the cleaning to Gregor's room to his sister, while on the left, he shouted at Gregor's sister, threatening that she would never again be permitted to clean Gregor's room, while his mother attempted to drag his father, now so agitated he hardly recognized himself, into the bedroom. Gregor's sister, shaking with sobs, pummeled the table with her tiny fist, and Gregor hissed loudly in fury, because it had occurred to no one that to shut the door in this room to spare him the sight of this commotion. But even if Gregor's sister, who was exhausted by her professional work, had wearied of caring for Gregor, she positively done, there was only no need for his mother to fill her shoes, and Gregor did have suffered neglect. For now the chairwoman was there, and his old widow, who had seen and survived the worst in her long life in the help of her sturdy bones, felt no particular repugnance toward Gregor. Without being all inquisitive, he had once chanced to open the door of his room, and, seeing Gregor, who had begun to run back and forth although no one was chasing him, she stood there staring in astonishment, her hands clasped across her lap. Ever since, they never failed to open the door in the crack of the moment every morning, meaning to look at him. At the beginning, she would call him over, saying that they would probably intend to found friendly, like, "Hey, over here, you old dung beetle," or "Just look at that old dung beetle," thus addressed. Gregor gave no reply, but insisted to remain where he was, immobile, as if the door had never been opened. If only the chairwoman, instead of being allowed to disturb him uselessly at whim, and even giving instruction to clean his room daily. Once early in the morning, a heavy rain, perhaps already important coming spring, was beating against the window pane. Gregor was so infuriated the chairwoman started up again with her quips that he turned on her as if to attack, immediately, slowly, decrepitly. But instead of being frightened, the chairwoman just picked up the chair that was standing beside the door and held it high in the air. And she stood there, her mouth gaped wide. Her intention was clear, not to close her mouth again until the chair in her hand had been crouching down upon Gregor's back. "Aha, so that's as far as it goes," she asked Gregor to turn around, and she the chair calmly back in his corner. Gregor now ate almost nothing at all. Only if it happened by chance to wander past the food that had been prepared for him that might be playfully to take a bite of something into his mouth, where he would hold it for hours, and then usually spit it out again later. At first he thought it was sorrow of the state of his room and prevented from eating, but the fact he had reassigned himself very quickly to the changes here. Everyone had gotten into the habit of using his room to store things where there's no place in the other part of the apartment. But now there was so much things, since one room of the apartment had been rented out to 3 lodgers. The solemn gentlemen, all 3 of them were bearded, as Gregor once noted, peering through the crack of the door, were scrupulously intent on having everything tidy, not just in their room, but also since they're now paying rent here, in the entire household, particularly the kitchen. They could not bear the presence of an unnecessary, much less dirty items. Moreover, they had brought most of their own furnishings with them. For this reason, many things had become superfluous, things that could not be sold, but they're too valuable to throw out. All this found ways into Gregor's room, as did the ash box and the garbage pail in the kitchen. The chairwoman, always in a great hurry, would simply fling any unserviceable item into Gregor's room. Mercifully, Gregor generally saw only the object in question in the hand that held it. The chairwoman may have intended at some point, when she had occasion a 3-minute, to come collect these things, or else throw them all out at once. But as it, they remained wherever they first landed, except when Gregor made his way through the refuse, stirring it around. At first, out of necessity, since there was no room left for it to crawl about, but later with ever-increasing pleasure, though after these wanderings, which left him morally exhausted and sad. He would spend hours without moving, since these lodgers sometimes also took their supper at home and shared a living room. The living room door remained shut for some evenings, but Gregor has opted to forego having the door open. In fact, even when it was open, he sometimes failed to take advantage of it, and instead, unbeknownst to his family, would remain lying in the darkest corner of the room. Once, however, the chairwoman had left the door into the living room slightly ajar, and ajar remained even when the lodgers came in that evening and struck their light. They sat down at the head of the table where the earlier times Gregor had sat with his father and mother, unfolded the napkins, and took up their knives and forks. At once Gregor's mother appeared in the doorway with a serving dish filled with meat, and right behind her came his sister, bearing a plate piled high with potatoes. A heavy vapor rose in the steaming food. The lodgers bent over the dishes that had been placed before him, as though wishing to inspect them before beginning their meal. And in fact, the one who sat in the middle and appeared to be the authority figure of the other 2 cut off a piece of meat right there on the platter to check whether it was tender enough and didn't have to be sent back to the kitchen. He was satisfied, and Gregor's mother and sister, who had been watching nervously, now smiled with relief. The family members themselves ate in the kitchen. Nonetheless, Gregor's father visited the living room on his way to the kitchen. With a single bow, cap in hand, took a tour around the table. The lodgers all rose from their seats and mumbled to their billiards. Left alone again, they almost ate in perfect silence. It struck Gregor as a peculiar that amid all the various sounds of this meal, one could also make out their championing teeth, as if to demonstrate to Gregor that person needs teeth to eat, and that one with splendid jaws, if toothless, can accomplish nothing at all. I'm hungry, Gregor thought sorrowfully to himself, but not for these things. Just look how these lodgers take their nourishment, while I am wasting away. On this very evening, Gregor couldn't remember having heard the violin once in all his time. The sound of it was heard coming from the kitchen. The lodgers had already finished their evening meal. The one in the middle had pulled the newspaper, giving each of the others a page, and now the 3 of them were reading and leaning back in their chairs and smoking. When the violin began to play, their interest was piqued. They got up from their chairs and tiptoed over to the door leading to the vestibule, where they stood in a tight cluster. The sound of the activity must have traveled to the kitchen, for Gregor's father now playing out. Are you gentlemen disturbed by this playing? It can be silenced at once. On the contrary, said the one in the middle, would the young lady care to join us and play here in the living room? There's much more comfortable and pleasant. Why, of course, Gregor's father exclaimed, as though if there were a violinist. The gentleman went back into the room and waited. Soon Gregor's father arrived with the music stand. Would the young lady care to join us and play here in the living room, where it is much more comfortable and pleasant? Why, of course, Gregor's father exclaimed, as though they were violinists. The gentleman went back into the room and waited. Soon Gregor's father arrived with the music stand. His mother had the sheet music, and his sister played the violin. His sister calmly prepared to play. His parents, who had never rented out the rooms in earlier days and therefore treated these lodgers with exaggerated deference, did not even dare to sit in their own armchairs. His father leaned against the door, his right hand tucked between his 2 buttons of the closed livery jacket. His mother, meanwhile, was offered an armchair by one of the lodgers, and since he left the chair where he had happened to place it, he sat off to the side in the corner. Gregor's sister began to play. On the other side, his father and mother attentively followed each movement of their hands, attracted by her playing. Gregor had ventured that bit further than usual, was already sticking his head through the living room. It scarcely surprised him that he had become so inconsiderate of the others earlier on. His considerators had been forced of pride, and had all more reason to keep himself hidden away now. Thanks to the dust that lay where in his room would whirl up the slightest motion. He too was covered in dust. He dragged around threads and hair of food scraps clinging to the back of his sides. His general indifference was far too great now for him to keep up with the habit he once practiced several times a day, flipping over the scrub his back against the rug. Despite his condition, he did not hesitate now to continue his advance a little way onto the immaculate floor of the living room. To be sure, no one paid him the slightest heed. The family was completely absorbed in the violin playing. The lodgers, on the other hand, having the first positioned themselves, hands in their trouser pockets, much too close behind the sister's music stand, so they could all look at the sheet music, which surely must have distracted her, soon withdrew the window, conversing in the undertone, and remained there, anxiously observed by Gregor's father. It appeared more than clear that they had been disappointed in their expectation of hearing beautiful or entertaining violin music, and now, tired of the whole performance, were continuing to tolerate disturbance of their peace only out of politeness, particularly in the way in which all of them were blowing the smoke of their cigars higher into the air for their noses and mouths suggests extreme agitation. And yet his sister's playing was so lovely, her face was so tilted to one side, searchingly sadly, her eyes followed the line of notes. Gregor kept a bit farther forward and ducked his head down to the close of the floor, so he perhaps to catch her eye. He was a beast. That music who moved him. He felt as he were being shown the way of the unknown nourishment he craved. He was determined to creep all the way up to his sister, to pluck the skirt in his way to indicate to her that she would come to his room and play her violin. So no one here was rewarding her playing and meant to reward her. How could he not allow her to leave his room ever again? At least as long as he was alive. The terrific figure would, for the first time ever, be useful to him. He could see all the doors and rooms at once, growling at his attackers, but sister would remain with him, not by force, but by their own free will. She would sit beside him to steady, bend down and better to hear, and would confess to her that his dad had the firm intention of sending him to the conservatory, and that if the disaster had not disrupted his plans, he would have made general announcement last Christmas. Christmas has passed now, hadn't it? Without letting himself be swayed by the objections of any sorts, after declaration his sister had been moved to the point of tears, and Gregor would raise himself to the height of an armpit and kiss her throat, which, now he had been to the office every day. He wore a free ribbon collar. Herr Samsa, the gentleman in the middle, shouted at Gregor's father, and without saying a single word, pointed his finger at Gregor, who was now only advancing. The violin fell silent. The middle lodger at first just smiled and shook his head, turning forward his hands, and then looked again at Gregor. Gregor's father apparently found the task of dragging Gregor back into his room less urgent than that of calming the lodgers, despite the fact that they did not appear particularly worked up and seemed to be finding Gregor the most entertaining in the music. He hurried over to them and tried with outspread arms to herd them back into the room, at the same time using his body to shield Gregor from the new view. And so they did, in fact, become a little angry, though it was no longer clear whether it was account of Gregor's father's behavior or the realization dawning on them that without their knowledge they might have been sharing the room with a roommate of his sort. They demanded explanations of Gregor's father. Now it was their turn to throw their arms into the chair. They plucked uneasily at their beards and only slowly withdrew the direction of the room. Meanwhile, Gregor's sister, who had been standing there at a loss since her playing had been so unexpectedly interrupted, she still held violin and a bow in her carelessly dangling hands, looking over the notes as though she was continuing to play. All at once pulled herself together, laid her instrument on the lap of her mother, who was sat in the armchair, her lungs heaving as she thought to breathe, and ran into the next room, toward which the lodgers were now moving somewhat more quickly as Gregor's father urged them now on. One saw how, beneath the sister's practiced hands, the beds, blankets, and pillows flew into the air into orderliness. Even before the lodgers reached the room, she had finished making up the beds and slipped out. Gregor's father appeared to be once more so firmly in the grip of his own stubbornness, he felt the basic respect that, after all, he owed his tenants. He kept on pressing and urging until, already standing in the doorway, the middle lodger thunderously stamped his foot, causing Gregor's father to stop short. "I hereby declare," he said, raising his hand and seeking out Gregor's mother and sister, who glanced at, "that in consideration of reprehensible circumstances prevailing in this apartment and family," and there he spat on the floor with that foresight, "I give notice on my room effective immediately. It goes without saying that I will not pay a penny for the days I have spent here. On the contrary, I shall consider whether or not to pursue with, please believe me, easily justifiable claims." He fell silent and went looking straight for her expectantly, and indeed his two friends once chimed with the words, "We too give notice effective immediately." Here up and he seized the door handle and with a great clash slammed the door. Gregor's father staggered his armchair with a groping hands and let himself fall into it. It looked as though he was stretching on his customary evening nap, but the violent nodding of his anchorless head showed that he was absolutely not sleeping. Gregor had gone to lying quietly on the spot where the lodgers had espied him. His disappointment that the failure of his plan and perhaps also the weakness caused by starvation and rendered him incapable of moving. With a certain defiance, he sensed terrified that everything was about to collapse all around him, and so he waited. Not even the violence started him when it fell to his mother's lap beneath the trembling fingers, giving off the note that echoed in the air. "Dear parents," his sister said, striking the table by way of preamble, "things cannot go on like this. Even if you two perhaps do not realize it, I most certainly do. I am unwilling to utter my father's name before this creature, and therefore will only say we have to try to get rid of it. We have done everything humanly possible to care for it and show it tolerance. I don't think anyone should reapproach just on this account." "He is right 1,000 times over," Gregor's father murmured under his breath. His mother, still incapable of breathing freely, began to cough dully into her lifted hand, the lunatic expression in her eyes. Gregor's sister hurried over to their mother and held her forehead. Her words seemed to have given her father an idea, for how she sat up straight, playing with her uniform cap between the plates left behind on the table of the lodger's supper and glancing over his time to quiet Gregor. "We have to try to get rid of it," his sister said, addressing her words exclusively for Gregor's father this time, for his mother was coughing too hard to hear anything. "It'll be the death of you two. I can see it now. When people have to work as hard as all of us have been doing, it is impossible to endure these endless torments at home. I cannot bear it any more either." And she burst into sobs, weeping so forcibly that her tears flowed down to his mother's face, from which the girl wiped with a mechanical gesture. "Child," his father said sympathetically, and with noticeable compassion, "but what can he do?" Gregor's sister just shrugged in the shoulders of the sign of helplessness, but had come over her while she was weeping, in contrast to the confidence and display of the moment before. "If he understood us," Gregor's father said, half questioning his sister, still caught up by their weeping, shook one hand vehemently at the sign of how unthinkable she found this. "If he understood us," his father repeated, closing his eyes to absorb their conviction as utterly out of the question. "Then it might be possible to come to an agreement with him. But as the other things stand, it has to go," your sister cried out. "What's the only way, father? You have to try to let go of the notion that this thing is Gregor. The real disaster that we believed this for so long. But now it could be Gregor. If it were Gregor, it would realize that a long time ago that it wasn't possible for human beings to live alongside such a creature. It would have gone away on its own. We still would have to be lacking a brother, but we would have been able to go on living and honoring his memory. But now we have a beast tormenting us. It drives away our lodgers and apparently intends to take over the entire apartment if it helps us together. Just look, father," he suddenly shrieked. "It's starting again, and it's just frightening," and Gregor found bewildering. She now went as far as to leave her mother behind, launching herself from her chair, as if she would rather sacrifice her mother than remain in Gregor's proximity, and ran to take cover behind her father, who, agitated by the way she was carrying on, rose from his own chair and half raised his arm as if to shield her. But Gregor was far from wanting to frighten anyone, above all his sister. All he'd done was turn around and make his way back into his room. Admittedly, his operation would have been hard not to notice, since his current injured state he was obliged to use the head to help with his difficult maneuver. He kept raising it up and then thumping against the floor, pausing as he glanced around. His good intentions seemed to only be recognized. It had been only momentary fright. Now all of them gazed sadly in silence. His mother lay in the armchair, her extended legs pressed together, barely able to keep her eyes open in her exhaustion. His father and sister sat side by side, and his sister had draped one hand across his father's neck. Perhaps I was allowed to turn around now, Gregor thought, and resumed his labors. He not entirely suppressed the wheezing and exertion produced, and now, when he had rest, otherwise no one was harassing him, he had been left to attend his matters on his own. When he had completed his rotation, he immediately made a straight for the door in his room. He was astonished at how great a distance separated him from his destination. He didn't understand how weak he was. He had been able to traverse the same distance in a little while before, almost without noticing, steadfastly concentrating only on crawling as quickly as possible. He scarcely paid any heed to the fact that a word, not a cry, came from his family to disturb him. But then only in the doorway did he turn his head, not all the way around, as he felt his neck growing stiff. But when even so he was able to see it that was changed behind him, except that the sister had risen to her feet. Last thing he saw was a glimpse of his mother, who had now fallen entirely asleep. No sooner was he in his room again than the doors hastily pressed shut, locked and bolted, and sudden commotion of his back gave him a frightful start, for his low legs gave way beneath him. It was his sister who hurried thus. He was already trying to stand there upright and waiting. Then past the light-footedly Gregor did hear her approach, and cried out finally to her parents as she turned the key on the lock. And now, Gregor wondered, while looking around in the dark, he soon made discover that he was no longer capable of moving at all. He wasn't surprised at this. On the contrary, it struck him as unnatural that he had acted until now able to support himself on those tiny, thin legs. As for the rest, he felt relatively ease. Immediately, his entire body was racked in pain. But it seemed to him that it was gradually becoming weaker and weaker, and in the end it would fade away altogether. Already he could scarcely feel the rotting apple on his back, though the inflamed area around it, both now involved in the soft dust. He thought back on his family with tenderness and love. In his opinion, he must say a means to disappear, and possibly even more empathetic than his of his sister. He remained in his state of empty, peaceful reflection until the clock tower struck the 3rd hour of morning. He watched as everything began to light around his window. Then his head sank all the way to the floor without violation from his nostrils. His last breath faintly streamed. When the Stryer woman arrived early the next morning, slamming the door so loudly that in her strength and haste, often she had been asked to avoid this, that sleep was out of the question anywhere in the apartment after her arrival. Her usual courtesy visit to Gregor's room revealed at first nothing out of the ordinary. She thought he was lying there motionless on purpose, feigning an indigestion. He considered him perfectly capable of rational thought. Since she happened to be holding a long broom in her hand, she tried to tickle Gregor with it in the doorway. When even this had no effect, she grew vexed and began to poke Gregor a little, and only when she had actually shifted him from the spot where he lay with no resistance and all were suspicions roused. When no soon after the facts of the matter came clear to her, he gawked in surprise, gave a low whistle, and then without further delay flung open the door into the bedroom with a loud voice shouted in the darkness. "Come have a look, it's gone," it croaked. "It's laying there, dead as doornail." Samson couple shot upright in their martial bed, and first had a struggle to recover from the shock of the chairwoman's conduct before they were able to grasp their words. But then Herr and Frau Sasma hurriedly got to the bed on the other side. Herr Sasma threw the blanket about his shoulders, while Frau Sasma emerged wearing only her nightdress. In this state, they entered Gregor's room. Meanwhile, the door to the living room, where Getty had been sleeping since the lodger's arrival, had opened as well. She was fully dressed, as though she had not slept at all, as even the pallor of her cheeks seemed to prove. "Dead?" Frau Sasma asked, looking questioningly up at the chairwoman. Although she herself was free to investigate, and indeed could see how things stood even when without hesitation. "I would say so," the chairwoman said, and by way of proof pushed Gregor's corpse quite some way to the side of her broom. Frau Sasma made a gesture as though he wanted to hold back the broom, but didn't. "Well," Herr Sasma said, "now we thank God." He crossed himself, and the 3 women followed his example. Gretty, who would not take her eyes off the corpse for a moment, said, "Just look how skinny he was. He went such a long time without eating anything at all. All the food that went to his room would come out again just as before." And indeed, Gregor's body was completely flat and dry, which hadn't really been noticeable until now, when he was no longer raised on those low legs, and nothing else remained of the distant gaze. "Gret, come sit by us for a bit," Frau Sasma with a melancholy smile, and Gret, glancing back at the corpse, following her parents into the bedroom. The chairwoman shut the door and opened the window wide. Despite the early morning, the crisp air was always tempered by the certain mildness. After all, it was already the end of March. The 3 lodgers now emerged from their room and looked at the astonishment for the breakfast. They had been forgotten. "Where's breakfast?" the one in the middle asked of the chairwoman peevishly, but she just put a finger on her lips and then quietly, without a word, beckoned the lodgers into Gregor's room. She bade them into their hands in the pockets of their slightly threadbare little jackets. They surrounded Gregor's corpse in the room that had been meanwhile so quite bright. And the bedroom door opened, and Herr Sasma appeared wearing his livery, with his wife on one arm and his daughter on the other. All 3 looked as if they had been weeping. Gret kept passing her face against her father's arm. "Leave my home at once," Herr Sasma said, pointing at the door without letting go of the womenfolk. "What do you mean?" the gentleman in the middle inquired, dumbfounded, and gave a saccharine smile. The other 2 held their hands at their backs and kept rubbing them together uninterruptedly, as if in gleeful expectation of a fight that was certain to decide in their favor. "I mean exactly what I say," Herr Sasma replied, now advancing the lodger, flanked by his 2 companions. The lodger just stood there at first, looked at the ground as if all the things were rearranging themselves in his head into a new order. "So we'll be leaving," he said then, looking up at Herr Sasma as if his new humility had suddenly come over him and required him to petition to approval even his decision. Herr Sasma merely nodded curtly in his direction a few times, goggle-eyed at this, and gentleman did, in fact, made haste to stride back out of the vestibule, where his 2 friends had listening attentively for some moments, their hands at rest, and now they practically hopped and skipped in their hurry to follow. As if word, Herr Sasma might somehow proceed into the vestibule, cutting off their line of communication with their leader. In the vestibule, all 3 of them took their hats on the coat rack, withdrew their walking sticks from the cane stand, made a silent bow, and left the apartment, displaying what soon proved to be utterly dumbfounded mistrustfulness. Her Sasma stepped out into the landing of the two women, leaning against the banister. They watched the three gentlemen descending the long staircase, moving slowly but at a steady pace, and disappearing into the floor of the certain bend of the stairway, only to appear again a few moments later. The farther down they went, the more the Sasma family's interest in them faded, and when the butcher's apprentice came forward and then passed them on the way out, profoundly bearing his tray upon his head. Herr Sasma, the woman abandoned the banister, and all of them returned, seemingly relieved, to their apartment. They decided to spend a day resting and go out for a stroll. They had not only earned the respite of their work, but desperately needed of it. And so they all sat at the table and wrote 3 letters of excuse. Herr Sasma to the supervisor, Frau Sasma to her employer, and Greti to his supervisor. While they were writing, the chairwoman came in as she was leaving. Her morning's work was completed. The 3 scribes at first merely nodded without looking up, and only when the chairwoman failed to do on her way they glanced up at annoyance. "Well?" Herr Sasma asked. The chairwoman stood smiling in the doorway as if she had splendid good fortune to announce to the family, but wouldn't do so until she was properly questioned. The nearly vertical little ostrich feathers on her hat, which had annoyed Herr Sasma for as long as she had been in the family service, bobbed gently in all directions. "So what is it you want?" she asked, bowed by Frau Sasma, the member of the family for whom the chairwoman still had most respect. "Well," the chairwoman replied, for her own good-natured laughter making it impossible at first for her to go on to speaking, "there's no need for you to go worry about how to get rid of that mess in there. It's already taken care of." Frau Sasma and Gret bent down over their letters as they went to go writing. Herr Sasma, who saw the chairwoman was about to start describing everything in detail, summarily silenced her with an outstretched hand, and since she was not permitted to say what she had wished, she suddenly remembered the great hurry she was in, and so with the insulted air she cried, "So long, everyone," turned wildly on her heel, and with the most excruciating slamming of doors left the apartment. "Tonight she'll be let go," Herr Sasma said, received an answer neither from his wife nor his daughter, but the chairwoman seemed to have disturbed the equanimity that they had already just attained. They arose from their seat, went to the window, and remained here for their arms about each other. Herr Sasma turned to his chair and looked and observed him quietly for a little while, then cried out, "So come here already, let those old matters rest, and show a little consideration for me as well." At once the woman obeyed, hurried over to him, and caressed him, and quickly finished their letters. When all 3 of them left the apartment together, something was not done in months, and took the electric tram all the way to the open countryside at the edge of town. The car in which they sat all alone and entirely suffused with warm sunlight. Closely leaning back in their seats, they discussed their future prospects, and on closer investigation it appeared these prospects were not bad at all. For all 3 of their positions, some things they had never before properly discussed were quite in fact advantageous, and above all, offered promising opportunities in advancement. The greatest and immediate improvement for the situation, of course, would be quickly achieved by moving to the new apartment. They now wished for to take a smaller and cheaper, but more convenient and above all more practical flat in their current one, which had been picked out for them by Gregor. As they were conversing in this way, Herr and Frau Sasma were stuck almost as one while observing their daughter, who was growing ever more vivacious. But the thought, and despite all the torments had been made her cheeks grow pale. She has recently blossomed to a beautiful virtuous girl, growing quieter now and communicating with one another almost unanimously by exchange of glances. They thought about how it would soon find her a good husband, and when they arrived at their destination, it seemed to them almost confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions, where her daughter swiftly sprang to her feet and stretched her young body. And that is the basic story of Metamorphosis. So now what we need to read after this is page 119, 2 pages 119 to 126, which is the one and only movement of this. 119 to 126, and we have to retire this again and then go back to this. So yeah, for now that'll be it, and then tomorrow will be like, you know, the ending, but for right now this is the actual ending of the actual story. So I hope you guys have a super fantastic, wonderful day. If you like, be efficient, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye.